The most impressive accomplishment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s career was not the March on Washington. It was not his legendary mountaintop speech, which he delivered in Memphis just one day before he was assassinated. It wasn't even marching in Selma, Alabama with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. To me, the most impressive thing that Dr. King ever did happened at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Birmingham in 1962. At the conference that year, Martin Luther King Jr. stood before a large integrated audience and he delivered the closing address. And as he was concluding his speech that day, a white supremacist and a Nazi, a man named Roy James, walked onto the dais and punched Dr. King right in the face, and then proceeded to beat him savagely in front of the audience. And after the first onslaught of blows, the crowd watched in astonishment as Dr. King stood up and he looked his attacker square in the face, and then he dropped his hands to his side. He didn't run. He didn't fight back. He simply stood there. And when members of the audience tried to restrain Roy James, Dr. King actually stopped them. He said, "Don't touch them, don't touch them. We have to pray for him." And then remarkably, the crowd began to pray and sing, and Dr. King spoke kindly to Roy James and led him into a private office where they spoke for a long time, face to face. And when Dr. King finally emerged from that office, Rosa Parks, who happened to have been at the conference, handed him 2 aspirin, and he finished his speech with an ice pack held to his face. And later he would say of that incident that it's one thing to take nonviolence as your lawfully wedded wife. It's quite another thing to do it while you're being beaten by a Nazi in front of your closest friends and supporters. And yet somehow miraculously he did that. And the question is how? How was Dr. King able to not only practice nonviolent resistance as he was being brutally beaten, but then he was able to speak to his attacker in a civilized, humane fashion and treat him like a human being? And I think the answer to that question can be found in this week's Torah portion. As Spencer spoke about so beautifully earlier this morning, Parshat Vayishlach contains the culmination of the lifelong saga of Jacob and Esau, which we began reading 2 weeks ago. And you probably remember the beginning of the story. First, Jacob manipulates Esau into selling him his birthright in exchange for a bowl of lentil stew. And then Jacob deceives both his father and his brother and steals the birthright blessing. And in response, Esau vows to kill his brother. And Jacob runs away. And the 2 brothers don't see each other for decades until this morning's Torah portion. And as you might imagine, after many decades of hatred and resentment towards one another building up, you would think that the brothers would be at each other's throats, that they would be ready to kill each other. But of course they don't kill each other. As the Torah tells us, "Vayichabkehu vayipol al tzavarav, vayishakehu vayivku," and Esau ran to meet his brother Jacob and embraced him, and he threw his arms around Jacob's neck and kissed him, and they wept together. And what prompted Esau to let go of his anger and his hatred and his bloodlust? Our classical commentators give many different answers to that question, but they all hinge on the idea that when the 2 brothers looked into each other's faces, their decades worth of animosity and hatred all fell away. As Jacob says to Esau at the moment of the reunion, "To see your face is like looking into the face of God." And that is why Dr. King couldn't hit Roy James, because he looked into his face and he saw the innate humanity in his eyes. And when you really look at someone, when you actually look at them, panim el panim, face to face, it becomes nearly impossible to hate them, let alone to hit them. According to the great 20th century French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, our ethical obligations are rooted in the face of the other. It is the face of the other that makes moral demands upon each and every one of us. As Levinas writes in his book, Ethics and Infinity, the first word of the face is "thou shalt not kill." And at the same time, the face of the other is destitute. It is the poor for whom I can do all and to whom I owe all. In other words, for Levinas, it is the act of looking into the face of our fellow human beings that inspires us both not to kill and compels us to feed the hungry. Ethics and morality are rooted in the face of the other. I have recounted the story from the Bima before, but it's certainly worth repeating this morning. There was a great rabbi who once asked his students, how do we know when the night has ended and the day has begun and it's time to pray the morning service? And his students pondered that question for a moment, and then one student said, when you can look out at the fields and you can distinguish between your field and the field of your neighbor, then you will know that the night has ended and the day has begun. But a second student said, no, that's not right. It's when you can see an animal in the distance and you can determine whether it's a cow or a horse or a sheep. That's when you know that the night has ended and the day has begun. And finally, a third student said, neither of you are right. It's when you can see the color of a flower and you can determine whether it's a red flower or a blue flower or a yellow flower. That's when you'll know that the night has ended and the day has begun. And finally, the rabbi said, actually, you're all wrong. And not a single one of you truly understands, because you all divide. You divide your field from the field of your neighbor. You distinguish one kind of animal from another. You separate one color from another. Is that all people can do? Divide and separate and fragment and split apart? And then the rabbi said, when you can look at the person next to you and you can see their face, really see their face, then and only then has the night ended and the day begun. And there's a halachic implication to that story. According to Jewish law, we can't daven shacharit, the morning service, until there is enough light to be able to look into the face of your fellow human being and really see that face. And so what can we learn from Martin Luther King Jr. and Emmanuel Levinas and Jacob and Esau? Hatred and bigotry and suffering will only end when we can truly learn to see one another, panim el panim, face to face. When we can look into the face of even our greatest enemies and acknowledge that they too are human beings. Because looking into the face of another person is how we acknowledge one another. It's how we truly come to know one another. And ultimately, it's how we learn to love one another. Shabbat Shalom. We continue now with Chatzi Kaddish on